The notice had come on a Tuesday. She knew this because she had been expecting the flower delivery, and when she heard boots on the porch steps, she had already turned toward the door with her hands still dusted white. The man who stood there was not the miller's boy. He wore a town clerk's expression, practiced, apologetic in the way that costs nothing, and he held out a folded paper without meeting her eyes. She took it, thanked him, closed the door. That had been 11 days ago. Now it was the 3rd of November, and the cold had settled into Harlan Crossing the way cold did in eastern Colorado, not all at once but incrementally, degree by degree, until one morning you noticed the water in the basin had a skin of ice, and you understood that winter had already moved in while you were looking at something else. She stood on the porch in the early light, reading the notice again. By right of deed, filed September the 14th, 1881, in the office of the county clerk, Pueblo County, Colorado Territory, the undersigned does herein assert legal claim to the eastern quarter-acre parcel, as described. The language ran on. She had read it far enough 3 times to know where it ended up. The loose step shifted under her foot as she turned the page. She did not look down. The step had been loose since the first frost of the year before, or perhaps the year before that. She had watched it loosen the way you watch a thing you expect someone else to address. He had always been the one to kneel on that second step with a hammer and 2 nails, and set it right before supper. She had handed him the nails each time, dropped them one by one into his open palm without being asked, because she always knew when he was about to ask. 4 years now. The step had gone unaddressed for 4 years, and she had stepped over and around it so many times that the avoidance was no longer deliberate. It was simply the way she walked onto her own porch. She folded the notice along its original creases. The eastern quarter-acre was the strip of land that ran from her back fence line to the property marker her husband had staked himself in 1876. The garden was on it. The small shed he had built the first summer was on it. The cattle broker 2 streets south had filed his competing claim 6 weeks ago, quietly, the way men with money and patience file things, not with any drama, but with the steady confidence of someone who expects the paperwork to do the work for him. She put the notice in her apron pocket. The street below was still mostly dark. A lamp moved behind the window of the general store. Smoke rose straight up from the livery. The air tasted like iron. She had 2 boarders to feed by 7 o'clock. She went inside. The summer of 1850 was the kind that cracked the earth. He had been working the Harlan Crossing parcel for 11 days, moving west to east across ground that resisted him. Rocky shelf beneath thin soil, the kind of terrain that turned a boundary stake into a contest of will. His chain man was a quiet boy from Missouri who had stopped talking after the 3rd day of heat and had not started again. They understood each other well enough. The morning of the 12th day, he rose before light and walked the eastern edge alone. The light came in low and flat, the color of old brass, and the grassland ran out ahead of him without apology. No tree line, no fence, only the slight drop where the ground softened toward a seasonal creek bed that would be dry by August and bone white by October. He stood at what his measurements told him was the boundary and looked south, then north. Somewhere in the calculus of chain lengths and magnetic declination, someone had made an error. He had found it the evening before, working by lantern, cross-checking his field notes against the preliminary plat. The error was not large, 42 feet, roughly, less than half a surveyor's chain. In open country, 42 feet meant nothing much. But boundary lines had a way of meaning more later than they did now. He had seen it. He had seen it enough. He drove the corrected stake himself, without the boy. The ground fought him, 3 strikes before the mallet found purchase, and his wrist ached from the angle. When the stake stood true, he crouched beside it and checked the alignment against his compass. The needle held. He sat back on his heels and looked at the land around him. Unnamed, unbuilt. Nothing here but grass bending east in the morning air, and the sound of a hawk working the thermals somewhere he couldn't see. He opened the plat and found the margin beside the eastern boundary notation, the original figure. He struck through it with two clean lines, not careless, not angry, simply final, and wrote the corrected measurement in his careful hand. 42 feet, true east. He initialed it and wrote the date. June 14th, 1850. He pressed his thumb flat against the ink to dry it, and looked at the impression it left on his skin. The land around him would take 30 years to become anything. A rail line, a main street, a woman stepping carefully around a loose porch step because the man who used to fix such things was gone. He could not have known any of that. He was a surveyor in a dry summer, correcting a number because the number was wrong, and because the work meant something to him even when no one was watching. He capped his pen, rolled the plat along its careful creases, and slid it back into the leather satchel. The hawk was gone, the grass bent east. He picked up the mallet and walked back toward camp. The afternoon train came in from the east with the sun behind it, and the platform at Harlan Crossing held its usual arrangement. 2 men waiting on a feed shipment, a woman collecting a parcel, the station master with his ledger open against his knee. The engine slowed and stopped and released its breath in a long hiss that scattered the sparrows from the water tower. Passengers came off in the usual order. A family with luggage stacked above what seemed reasonable. A commercial traveler who knew the station master by name. A man in a pale suit who looked immediately uncomfortable with the dust. And then, last, him. He stepped down from the car slowly, not from age, but from the deliberateness of a man who does not hurry toward anything. The scarred leather satchel rode his right shoulder. He carried nothing else. He stood on the platform for a moment and looked at the main street the way a man looks at a map, orienting, locating, not impressed and not disappointed. He crossed to the Dennison place first, the only boarding house on the south end of town. The woman there looked at the land office seal on his papers and told him she had no vacancy. There was a room visible behind her, its door standing open, a chair placed before an empty window. He thanked her without any particular feeling and walked back out. June 14th, 1850. The grass had bent east all day. The surveyor had worked the eastern line twice, because the first time, the chain had read wrong, and he did not trust a wrong number simply because it was convenient. He drove the corrected stake himself, marked the measurement on the plat, and stood for a long moment looking at the line he had drawn between what would belong to one man and what would belong to another. He had never met either of them. He would not. But the line would remain. He picked up the satchel and walked toward camp. The boarding house on the north edge of the main street had a sign she had painted herself 4 years ago. The letters slightly larger than they needed to be. The kind of thing a person does when they are not certain of anything else. He came around from the main street and saw the loose front step from 10 feet out, the slight depression of the board on the left side, the way it sat a 1/4 inch lower than it should. He knocked. She opened the door and looked at his papers, the way a woman looks at something she has already decided about. She did not look at the land office seal. She looked at the satchel, then at his face, then back at the page. He said he needed a room, work permitting, probably through the end of August. She said it was $4 a week with meals. He said that was fine. She stepped back from the door, and he came in out of the afternoon light. She showed him the room at the end of the hall. It was small, a bed, a washstand, a window that looked north toward the open country past the last storefront. The curtain was plain cotton, bleached by years of morning light. She told him the privy was behind the woodshed and that breakfast was at 6:30, and she did not hold it for late risers. He set the satchel down beside the bed. She noticed he did not set it on the floor. He set it against the wall where the leg of the bed would brace it upright. She left him to it. June 1850, 3 weeks into the commission. The sun was already high by 7 in the morning, and the ground out on the eastern reach of the founding parcel had given them trouble since the second day. Not the grade was manageable. The rock shelf. It ran beneath the surface like a buried thing that had decided not to move, which was exactly what it was. The standard stake would not seat. You could drive it down 8 inches and it would hold for an afternoon. But the frost cycle would work it loose inside a winter, and a loose stake was worse than no stake at all. A loose stake was an argument waiting. He had driven the eastern boundary stake 18 inches, down through the topsoil, through the clay layer beneath, until the mallet struck something that did not give. That was the shelf. That was solid. He had noted the depth in the margin of the plat and initialed it. EB stake 18 inches, rock shelf confirmed, boundary fixed, and drawn a small cross-section in pencil beside the notation. The kind of detail no one ever asked for, but that would answer a question someday, if the question came. It had taken the better part of an afternoon. His shirt had soaked through by noon. The other man on the commission, a younger clerk from Pueblo, had sat in the shade of the wagon and watched without comment. He did not mind. Some work you do alone. When it was done, he had smoothed the oilskin over the plat, folded it once along the horizontal, once along the vertical, and slid it into the document sleeve they would carry back to the county seat. The ink was dry. The notation was clear. He signed the bottom of the sheet with the date, June the 14th, 1850, and did not think of it again. The plat was filed at Pueblo 3 days later. He had other commissions by then. The land at Harlan Crossing passed out of his attention the way land always did once it was mapped. Fixed, certain, belonging to itself. Below the boarding house, the rock shelf still ran east to west beneath the topsoil. Unchanged. 31 years of frost, and it had not moved an inch. The first 3 days he came down for meals at 6, and at 6, morning and evening, as though he had consulted a schedule and found it satisfactory. He set his satchel beside his chair. He did not set it against the wall or under the table, but beside the chair, within reach, and she noticed that his hand rested near it, even when he was eating. She put food on the table and sat at the far end with her coffee. The school teacher came down at 6:30, said good morning to the room without directing it at anyone in particular, and ate with the unhurried patience of someone who had breakfasted alone for many years before there was company again. The three of them managed it without effort. A kind of equilibrium settled, the way water settles, finding its level without being told where that is. He did not ask about the house. He did not ask about the land. He ate what she set before him and returned his plate to the kitchen, and she heard him climb the stairs at a pace that was neither quick nor slow. He was gone before first light each morning, the satchel across his shoulder, heading toward the land office annex, 2 blocks east of the rail terminus. She knew this not because she watched, but because the floorboard at the top of the stairs reported weight and absence both, and she had learned its register over 4 years of mornings. The 4th morning she rose at her usual hour, pulled on her boots in the gray dark, and came out the back door to start the stove. She crossed the porch without thinking. Her foot came down on the step and the step held, solid. No give, no creak, no small sideways shift that she had been accommodating for months without realizing she had built the accommodation into her body. She stopped. The wood was the same weathered gray, but there were 4 new nails along the front edge, their heads bright against the old boards. The kind of bright that meant yesterday, or before yesterday, or this morning before the light came. She stood there. Not long. 30 seconds, perhaps less. Long enough that the cold came up through the soles of her boots, and she became aware of the sky beginning its first pale adjustment in the east. She put her weight on the step again, deliberately. It held the way things hold when they have been done right. He was already gone. his window dark, his chair empty, the satchel with him wherever he worked. She went inside and started the stove and did not say anything about it, because there was no one to say it to, and because the step was fixed and the cold was in, and the coffee needed to be hot before the schoolteacher came down, and that was the shape of the morning. She put the kettle on. She did not look at the step again. The plat was finished before noon. He had been working since first light, the eastern sky still gray when he made the final notations in the margin. Boundary stake corrected. Offset measured twice. Initialed in the cramped hand he had learned from watching the same work done at the same kind of table 31 years before. He folded the oilskin along its original creases. The paper took the fold the way old paper does, settling into it without resistance, as if it had been waiting to return to that shape. He pressed it flat with his palm. Outside the window, the Colorado sky had opened into the high, pale blue of a June afternoon, and the light falling across the table showed the dust on everything and the care in the lines he had drawn. He set the plat in the case beside the others and sealed the case with the brass clasp and did not look at it again. 31 years later, in the back room of the Land Office Annex on the east end of Harlan Crossing's main street, his son opened the same satchel. The leather was darker now along the handles. The seam at the bottom had been repaired once, badly, and then a second time with better thread that had since begun to fray. He set it on the table and worked the clasp open with the particular pressure it required. A half turn left before it would release, a habit he had learned by handling the bag every day for 3 months, without ever having asked his father why the clasp stuck. He had not asked, because by the time he understood the bag would be his, there was no one left to ask. The commission papers were in the lower compartment, bound with a cotton tape that had faded from red to something close to rust. He undid it. The territorial assignment was on top, then the survey maps for the parcels east of the rail line, then beneath those, in a folded packet that did not match the others in size or color, his father's county records. Filed carbons. Reference copies kept for cross-verification, the kind of documents a careful man carries when he works in country where the original records are 2 days' ride from the nearest clerk. He set them on the table. He was reading through the parcel numbers methodically, the way the work required. Left column, right column, cross-referencing against the competing deed that had come across his desk 4 days prior, the one filed 6 weeks ago by the cattle broker, the one with the boundary line that had made him stop and look again before he set it down. He found his father's notation on the 3rd page. The parcel number was the same. He sat with that for a moment. The room was quiet. Outside, a wagon was moving past on the frozen street, the iron wheel rims loud against the cold. He looked at the notation again, his father's hand, the date, the initialed correction in the margin. He did not move. The knock came mid-morning, when the light was low and flat across the frozen street. She was in the kitchen, her hands in flour, and she heard it before she crossed the room. A deliberate knock, the kind that does not expect to wait. She wiped her hands on her apron. She straightened. Then she walked to the front door and opened it. 2 men stood on the porch. One was the cattle broker. He was built wide across the shoulders, well dressed for Harlan Crossing, a man who wore his prosperity carefully so it would be noticed. Beside him stood a younger man in a dark coat with a soft-sided case under one arm, a lawyer. She recognized the type before the broker had spoken a word. "Mrs.," he began. "I know who you are," she said. The broker had the look of a man who had done this before, the flat patience of someone who expects the inconvenience to resolve itself in his favor if he simply does not hurry. He held out a folded document. "My attorney has reviewed the original filing. I thought it was right to inform you in person." She did not take the paper. "The boundary line," the lawyer said, stepping in where the broker had let silence sit. "As recorded in the competing deed, places the eastern quarter-acre of this property within the parcel acquired by. I can read, she said. The lawyer stopped. She stood in the doorway without moving back. The cold came in around the edges of the frame. She did not reach for her shawl. She looked at the broker and let the moment sit long enough that he shifted his weight, just slightly, from one foot to the other. I will have my own answer by the end of the month, she said. The broker's expression did not change exactly, but something behind it did. He had expected something else, tears perhaps, or a woman who reached for the paper because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. What he had found instead was a woman who held a door frame like it was already decided. The filing stands, the lawyer said. The timeline for. Good day, she said, and closed the door. She stood with her hand flat against the wood for a moment. In the hallway behind her, without a sound, the schoolteacher stood watching from the shadow near the kitchen door. The old woman said nothing. She simply looked at her, not with pity, which would have been unbearable, but with the particular steadiness of someone who has been watching longer than the crisis has been running. She did not turn around. She went back to the kitchen and put her hands in the flour again. The end of the month. She had said it without knowing whether it was true, without knowing what answer she expected to find, or who might be carrying it. He was not home. The flour was still on her hands when she heard the front door. Not the broker, not the lawyer. The weight of the step was different, heavier in the heel, unhurried. She did not look up. He came through the hallway and stopped in the kitchen doorway. She could feel him taking in the room, the lamp, the deed spread flat on the table, her hands resting on either side of it. She had not been reading it. She had been sitting with it, the way you sit with something you cannot fix but cannot put away. He set his hat on the hook by the door. She heard him pull out the chair across from her. No question asked, no apology for the intrusion. He simply sat, the way a man sits when he has decided something is his business, and is prepared to make that case without words. She did not look up immediately. When she did, his eyes were on the deed. Not on her. He had given her that. She watched him read the boundary description, the metes and bounds, the language of chains and stakes and compass bearings that her husband had stood over in a surveyor's office and believed meant something permanent. The broker's competing deed used the same language. That was the whole of the problem. Two documents, the same words pointed in different directions. He reached across the table. She had expected him to pull the deed closer, to angle it toward the lamplight. Instead, his fingers stopped, just below the eastern boundary line. He did not touch the paper. He held his finger an inch above it, tracing something she could not quite follow. Then he sat back. He reached for his satchel, the one that had been on his shoulder or under his hand, or buckled to his saddle every day she had known him. She had never seen it set down in this house. Not once. He placed it on the table between them. The clasp was worn brass, the leather darkened along the bottom seam, in the way that only years of handling could darken it. He pressed the clasp open with his thumb, not to reach inside. The gesture itself was what mattered. The thing was open on the table between them, and he left his hand flat beside it. She looked at the satchel, then at him. His expression had not changed. It was the same face he brought to everything, level, unhurried, giving nothing away. But his hand stayed where it was, flat on the table, next to the open satchel, next to her husband's deed. She did not ask what was inside. He did not offer. The lamp threw their shadows long against the kitchen wall, and outside, the last of the light was going out of the sky, over the eastern quarter-acre, the parcel someone else had decided should not be hers. He stayed. The night his father drove the eastern stake into that ground, the sky over the purgatoire drainage had been going orange along the bottom and green along the top, the way it does in early June when the air still carries the cold from the mountains and the light bends through it sideways. That was what his father had written in the margin. Sky orange low, green high, June 4th, 1850. Wind from the northwest at a walking pace. Then, below that, in a smaller hand, as if added after the formal notation was complete. Eastern stake corrected. Original position per chain measurement, placed 4 feet, short of true line. Error in initial run due to magnetic deviation at this location. Stake repositioned. True boundary 4 feet east of first mark. Confirmed by second chain. EHW, 4 June 1850. The initials were his father's. The date was the same date as the survey plat itself, written in the same ink, the same hand, without the tremor that would come later. It had been filed in Pueblo, recorded in the county ledger for June of that year. But when the county compiled its index in 1863, a rushed work, done by a clerk in 3 weeks when the office was moving buildings, the marginal notations were not transcribed. The plat itself was filed. The correction was not entered into the index. It existed only on the oilskin, in that margin, in his father's hand. The competing deed had been drawn from the 1863 index. The error had been present in every county document since then, 18 years of it. 4 feet. The eastern quarter-acre of her property held its shape because of 4 feet. Because of a magnetic deviation his father had noticed, noted, corrected, and initialed at the end of a long June day, with the sky doing something remarkable overhead. His father had written one more line below the initials, not notation, but something else, the kind of thing surveyors sometimes put in the margins when they think no one will look. The ground is correct, the paper must follow. He had read those words for the first time 3 months ago, after the funeral, going through the satchel in the dim of his father's house in Pueblo. He had read them twice. Then he had sat for a while with his hands in his lap. He had not known, when he took the Territorial Commission West, that it would bring him here. He had not known this parcel, this town, this woman standing across a kitchen table from him, with her hands quiet at her sides. The satchel lay open between them. Outside, the eastern quarter-acre sat in the dark, holding its shape, 4 feet wider than anyone had thought to look. He left before first light. She heard the creak of the third stair, the one that had always announced departures, and she lay still and listened to the sound of it settle, the front door, the cold latch, then nothing. By the time she came downstairs, the coffee was already made. He had left it on the stove. The cup he had used was washed and turned upside down on the counter. She looked at it for a moment, then poured for herself and went to the window. His horse was gone from the livery rail. She did not ask the liveryman where the surveyor had ridden. She did not ask the station agent whether he had taken the morning train east. She went back to the boarding house and she put 2 new cakes of soap in the room at the end of the hall, and she rehung the curtain rod that had been leaning slightly since September. 2 days passed. The school teacher ate supper both evenings and said very little, which was his custom, but his eyes moved to the empty chair once each meal. She did not acknowledge it. On the second night, she sat on the porch after dark. The loose step was still loose. She put her foot on it and felt it give, the same 1/4 inch it had always given, and then she went inside. He came back on the 3rd morning, before the town was properly awake, with dust on his coat and a tiredness around his eyes that read like more than 2 days of riding. She was in the kitchen when she heard the step, felt it, really, the familiar give of it beneath his weight, then the door, then the sound of him setting the satchel down in the hall, just for a moment, before he picked it up again. She put a plate in front of him without asking. He sat and ate without looking up from the table. This was not unusual. He was often quiet at meals, but there was a quality to this quiet that was different from his ordinary kind. Not the quiet of a man with nothing to say, but the quiet of a man carrying something he had not yet decided how to set down. She noticed the satchel when she turned to the stove. It sat against the wall where he always placed it, but it did not sit the way it usually sat. It leaned differently, heavier through the bottom, as if something had been added to what it already held. She refilled the coffee. She did not look at the satchel again. He ate everything on the plate. He set the fork down parallel to the knife, the way he always did when he was finished. Then he sat for a moment with both hands flat on the table. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had been doing it for 4 years. He pushed back from the table before she had finished the coffee. She heard him in the hall, the particular sound of the satchel being lifted, not the easy lift of habit, but something more deliberate, like a man picking up something he had already decided to carry through. The front door opened and closed. She stood at the stove and listened to his boots on the steps. The loose one gave its small complaint under his weight, the way it always did, and then the sound moved off the porch and into the street and was gone. June 1850. The Platte margin, lower right. His father's hand, smaller than she would have imagined from the satchel, from the careful columns. Boundary stake relocated 14 feet east per physical survey. Original placement in error. Corrected this date. 2 initials. A date. Ink that had sat in the oilskin fold for 31 years without fading entirely. Outside, the grass was the kind of green that only comes in early summer, on land that has not yet been grazed down. The light was flat and good for measurement. The kind of day a surveyor remembers. The land office annex sat at the south end of the main street, past the livery, in a low building with a tin roof that ticked in the afternoon heat. She had been inside it once, 4 years ago, 6 weeks after the lung illness had finished what it started, when she had gone to establish the deed in her own name. She had not gone back. He was inside it for most of the morning. She made bread. She took the school teacher's washing off the line before the wind picked up. She replaced a button on a man's coat, one of the traveling salesmen, due to leave on the Thursday train. Small work. Work that kept her hands busy and her mind in the room. The button was nearly set when she heard the boots on the porch step. She did not turn around. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She could feel him standing there, the way you feel a shift in the light when a cloud moves across the sun. Not dramatic, simply present. She set the coat down. The claim won't hold. 4 words, flat and certain as a stake, driven to the correct depth. She did not move for a moment. Something in her chest that had been braced for 4 years, not long enough to name, not short enough to ignore, shifted a half degree in its socket. She picked up the coat again. "Thank you," she said, to the coat, to the table, to the window that looked out on the eastern quarter-acre she had not let herself look at directly in 6 weeks. He stayed in the doorway a moment longer. Then he went to hang his satchel in the hall. 1 week passed. The legal notice came down from the mantelpiece on a Tuesday. She did not make ceremony of it. She folded it once, and then again, and set it in the stove while the morning fire was still taking hold. The paper caught at the corner first, then all at once. She stood there until it was gone. The step had been fixed sometime in the night between Wednesday and Thursday. She did not hear him do it. She came down in the early dark to start the kitchen, and her foot found the board solid underfoot. No give, no hollow knock, just the plain resistance of wood properly set. She stopped on it, stood on it a moment longer than necessary. Then she continued to the kitchen. She did not mention it. Neither did he. By Friday, the frost had moved in from the north. She could feel it before she opened the door, a tightening in the air, the quality of silence that comes when everything outside has gone still and cold and definite. She pulled her shawl across her shoulders and looked out the window above the basin. The ground was white, all the way to the edge of the property. The eastern quarter-acre lay under it the same as the rest, the frost making no distinction between contested and clear, between what had been in question and what had not. The boundary was there. It had always been there. 31 years of it, written in a dead man's hand on a fold of oilskin paper. She turned from the window. She set the kettle on. She took down one cup and set it on the counter. Then she reached up and took down a second one and set it beside the first. She did not think about it while she was doing it, or if she did not stop. She heard his door at the end of the hall, his boots on the floor, deliberate and unhurried. The sound of the satchel set against the wall rather than carried. Left there, where a thing is left when a man does not expect to need it before evening. He came through the kitchen doorway. She had her back to him. She poured his cup first, and then her own, and set the kettle back on the iron. She did not turn around until she had done all of that. He sat down. She set his cup in front of him, and took the chair across the table, and wrapped both hands around her own. Outside, the frost lay white and unbroken all the way to the eastern line. Inside, the kitchen held the warmth of the fire, and the smell of the coffee, and the particular silence of two people who have said everything they are going to say, and found it is enough.